Oh, okay. Hi, Lynn. Hi, Bobby Blue Eyes. Hi, April Sunset. Hi, the Brian Clan. Hi, April Sunset. You've got sound now. You've got sound now. You was glued to a decoupage video. Welcome back, and you'll see. Hey, you're back. It took me a little time to get back online. But what I was saying about Joan, see, it was 2:45 at the afternoon of April 19th, 1973, when she went to deliver the cookies. And then the mother said about 10 minutes later, the next door neighbor, as she told Rosemary afterward, heard the insistent barking of her dog, Boozer. Joan loved walking and playing with Boozer, and Boozer loved her. When Joan didn't come back right away, Rosemary didn't think much about it. She had probably gone to her friend Tamara's house on the corner. It was that kind of neighborhood where you could go in and out of houses of people you knew. The social butterfly could always find someone to hang out with or something to do. But at 4:45, so 2 hours later, when the music teacher came for Marie, her sister, her 8-year-old sister, piano lesson, Rosemary started to get worried. She didn't want to convey it to the children, so she tried to hold herself together. After all, it was a safe neighborhood with an FBI agent and a minister living nearby. So she started making phone calls, and Joan wasn't at any of the houses she called, and no one had seen her. And when her husband, Frank, got home about 10 minutes to 6, and Rosemary told him Joan was missing, Frank was a computer systems analyst, methodical and taciturn by nature. Rosemary could see instantly how worried and tense he was. But as usual, he held it all in, Rosemary said. We have to call the police. Frank agreed and made the call, and then he went out with Frankie and Marie, the two older kids, the 8 and 9-year-old, to drive around the neighborhood looking for Joan. They covered the entire area. And when they returned without having spotted or found anyone who had seen her, Rosemary decided to go out herself. Frank didn't want to come. She remembered that as Joan ran out, she said something about collecting on the last of the cookie orders, and that she'd seen the new car. The car belonged to the McGowan house, and Joseph McGowan taught chemistry at Tappan Zee High, just over the state line in Orangeburg, New York. The house was owned by his mother, Genevieve McGowan, and he lived there with her and Genevieve's mother, his grandmother. Okay, so then when she went there, she took her sons reluctantly so she wouldn't be alone. And together they walked up to the red brick and beige siding bi-level with a driveway and a 2-car garage in the left front. And they climbed the 5 front steps and rang the bell. She told Frankie to stay on the landing. Mr. McGowan, 27 years old now, answered the door. Rosemary says he seemed as if he had just come out of the shower. He was a 27-year-old bachelor. Rosemary didn't know him, but my children said he was very nice. Rosemary stepped into the foyer. She wanted to stand exactly where she knew Joan had recently stood. She was already starting to get an eerie feeling. She introduced herself. Have you seen my daughter Joan? She asked. She came here to deliver cookies. No, I haven't seen her, he replied. He spoke in a casual, matter-of-fact manner, and it was at that very moment that Rosemary D'Alessandro felt everything go cold. After standing in the foyer for a couple of minutes, I noticed a long fire truck parked in front of his house, she said. We had called the police, and when I saw that they were responding this way, it just all came to me at that moment that I knew my life would never be the same. She was almost immediately struck by McGowan's reaction, or rather lack of reaction. As I was standing there in the foyer with him, tears were welling in my eyes, and he looked at me like he absolutely didn't have 1 ounce of feeling. And what he did at that moment, when he saw my tears, he walked up the steps to the upper floor, and he stayed right there facing me, holding his slim cigar, and waited for me to leave. Walking back to my house, I knew that he knew what had happened to Joan. So she knew right there. And then he says, listen to this one. This is when So the chief medical examiner for Rockland County, New York, said Joan's case was one of the most emotionally difficult in his long and distinguished career. Word had spread quickly from Hillsdale Police Department to the Bergen County District Attorney's Office, and from there to the police division of the Rockland County Sheriff's Office. So early in the afternoon on Easter Sunday, before that one, I wanted to show you what had happened to him, because it was very quickly that they caught him. Here's what here's the things he said. Rosemary told them about her suspicion, and like I said, he helped them look for Joan. And then the Hillsdale police chief, Philip Verisco, was on vacation in Florida because it was, think about the Easter week, right? But when he was informed of Joan's disappearance, Hillsdale was the kind of community, and Verisco was the kind of leader that made it unthinkable that the chief of police would not be present for a trauma like this, so he rushed back home. Verisco, who passed away in 2012 at the age of 89, was a complete professional. He attended the FBI National Academy program in Quantico to make himself and his force as effective as possible. The chief went to the Alessandro's house the next day. Rosemary was sitting on her front steps when he came up the walkway, and he told her he was taking personal charge of the investigation. While not promising a happy outcome, he knew was unlikely. See, he knew it was unlikely because she had not been found right away. And this was back in 1973. It was unlikely. He reassured her that everything would be done the right way. He asked for a photograph, and then, let's see. The police questioned several possible suspects. People reported a man driving around, but they all had, reasons for being there. And then Rosemary had related her creepy encounter with McGowan. Her father had seen him taking out the trash the day after Joan's disappearance, and pointing to the house on the corner, said to Rosemary, "Something's not right over there." So they knew. Police officers and detectives spoke to McGowan both Friday and Saturday. Okay, this is similar to the Faye as again. And where was I? After asking him to account for himself in the minutes and hours after Joan went to his house. They said he was calm, amiable. He said that he denied that he saw Joan on Thursday. Instead, he calmly said he was at a nearby supermarket buying groceries at the time Rosemary said her daughter went to his house. What about the car Joan saw pull into the driveway? Did someone see it leave the garage? No, he said he walked to the grocery store. At which cash register did you check out? He couldn't remember what one he checked out at. Could he show the grocery receipt? He thought the trash, he said he threw it away and he thinks the trash had already been picked up. What did he buy? They asked him. He said steaks and apples, among other things. They asked him if the steaks were still in the refrigerator. He said no. He and his mother had eaten them. What about the apples? He said he wasn't sure. Seasoned detectives develop a natural sense for knowing whether a suspect's story and profession of innocence is true. Okay, so then he goes on. And they brought him in for questioning, and Joan's friend, Rich, recalled a large crowd in front of the police station as McGowan was inside being questioned. To his young eyes, it seemed as if the entire town was gathered there. As the seeming holes and contradictions in McGowan's statements grew increasingly glaring, the detectives asked him to submit to a polygraph. He agreed. McGowan failed the polygraph, and when detectives informed him, they confronted him with all his statements that didn't add up. Finally exhausted and without any answers, he asked for a priest. He and the priest met privately, and McGowan confessed to him. He then confessed to the detectives and told them that after he killed Joan, he drove her body across the New York state line and deposited it in Harriman State Park in Rockland County, about 20 miles away. Chief Verisco took it upon himself to be the one to tell Rosemary and Frank. It was a little after 4 p.m. A deeply sensitive man, he brought a Catholic priest with him, and together they sat with Rosemary at the kitchen table. Rosemary remembers removing the tablecloth from the white table to delay, if only for a few minutes, what she knew was to come. When the chief told her what McGowan had said, she cried, "I want to kill him." She said she was feeling rational and in control as she said it, knowing at the time she didn't mean it, but needing a way to release the anguish consuming her. The priest admonished her not to speak that way. "What do you expect, Father?" Verisco said. Hey there. Hi, Mandy McCracken. How are you? So, let's see. And I just want you to hear, let's see. Okay, so when... So early in the afternoon on Easter Sunday, Officer John Forbes drove to the location described to him at Harriman State Park, just off Gate Hill Road, near the southern end of the park, and there he found the naked and battered body of a young white female. She was face up in a wedge-shaped crevice between two boulders on a leafy slope under a rock ledge. Her head was twisted sharply to the left, and she was facing down the slope. Forbes had 4 young children of his own, and he struggled not to break down. He called in the crime scene team, and by the time Dr. Zugaby arrived, less than an hour later, the cordoned-off crime scene was already populated by a horde of police officers, crime scene technicians, detectives, FBI agents, reporters, press photographers, and the generally curious. He immediately ordered the officers to remove all non-essential personnel immediately. Richard Collier, the D. Alessandro's neighbor, who was also an FBI special agent working out of New York City, came in to identify the body. Yes, it was Joan. Though the crime scene was no longer pristine, her body had not been moved or touched. Dr. Zugaby immediately noted the lividity, the purpling of the flesh around her abdominal area. This told him she had not been killed at this spot. If she had been, the lividity would have been concentrated in her back due to gravity. Since that type of blood settling takes at least 6 hours, he knew that she just hadn't been dumped there. He took her body temperature and found that it matched the temperature of the air. That indicated that she had been dead for at least 36 hours, the time it takes for a body to cool completely. The finding was confirmed for him by the absence of rigor mortis, a post-mortem stiffening of the muscles that begins several hours after death and subsides within 24 to 36 hours. Taking all the observable physical evidence together, Dr. Zugabe estimated that Joan had been dead for approximately 50 hours. When he was able to do a more sophisticated test during the autopsy, he upped his estimate to about 70 hours, which meant that she had died within a couple of hours or less of when Rosemary last saw her. So same kind of thing as Faye, died very soon after they went missing. The sheriff's office conducted a thorough search of the surrounding area and found a gray plastic shopping bag printed with Mobile logo, and the bag was neatly packed rather than haphazardly stuffed and contained the clothing Joan had been wearing when she disappeared: a pair of red and white sneakers, a turquoise shirt, maroon pants, white socks, and white underwear that were stained red with blood. Before the body was moved, the officer called the Marian Shrine in Stony Point, New York, and asked a priest to come to the scene. And when he arrived, illuminated by the police lights, in the presence of officers, detective, FBI agents, the reporters, he administered last rites to Joan Angela D'Alessandro. Once the priest was finished, Zugabe officially pronounced dead, a seemingly obvious observation, but a necessary formality in any murder investigation. And then, let's see. Essentially, Joan was beaten, choked, sexually assaulted, and ultimately battered to death. But according to Dr. Zugabe, it was even worse than that. Had she died right after the beating and strangulation, her face and body would not have appeared swollen. Upon death, the homeostatic functions that cause swelling at an injured site shut down, and since swelling takes about a half an hour to be completed, he concluded that Joan must have been alive for at least that long following the attack. Mercifully, she was almost always certainly unconscious. The medical examiner's close examination of her neck revealed 2 areas of injury: the thyroid cartilage and the hyoid bone. His conclusion was that there was a half an hour or so after the deadly attack, the offender, unsure that he had killed her, returned to finish the job with a second manual strangulation. This sounds completely believable to me. With someone like Joseph McGowan, an inexperienced killer, it would not be unusual for him to be unsure of how effective he had been dispatching his victim and wishes to take no chances. So he did say that he did that twice as well in his confession. So his confession here, and you can read this. This is public information as it says here. What kind of man or monster spontaneously does something like this to a 7-year-old girl? And this is John Douglas now. I asked myself as I read through the case, a quarter of a century later. That's what I would find out. McGowan repeated his confession to Dr. Noel Galen, a forensic psychiatrist who had recently received his neurology and psychiatric training at Bellevue Hospital in New York and consulted for the New Jersey court system. The day after his indictment, McGowan detailed to Dr. Galen how he answered the door, and when Joan told him what she was there for and said she would come with him downstairs so he could get the money for her, she must have hesitated or resisted, because he admitted grabbing her and forcing her into the downstairs bedroom. Meanwhile, McGowan's 87-year-old grandmother, hard of hearing, was watching television upstairs. His mother was at work. And then Douglas says, I'm not revealing any privileged information from McGowan's file or medical records. All of the evaluations and analysis I am citing were contained and published in the appellate decision, Joseph McGowan, defendant appellant versus New Jersey State Parole Board respondent, decided by the Superior Court of New Jersey on February 15, 2002. As he told Dr. Galen once in the bedroom and safely away from the street, McGowan ordered Joan to take off her clothes, though he says she never completed the act. He became excited and did something on his fingers only inches from Joan, and then he penetrated her digitally. He probably couldn't wait and did this before she was completely undressed, and that's why her underwear were stained with blood. Since he acknowledged he had stuff on his fingers, we can't say for sure whether he completed the act or not, but the blood and injuries to Joan indicated a brutal assault. It was at this point, according to McGowan's account, that the consequences of his impulsive action dawned on him. All of a sudden, he told Dr. Galen, I realized what I had done. If I let her go, my whole life was gone. All I could think of was just to get rid of her. As an investigator, I have to say that from a criminologist's perspective, this part makes sense to me. In a high-stress situation like this, a smart offender, smart in quotes, will tend to have only one thing on his mind, getting away with his crime. This is apparently what happened with McGowan. Whether Joan lived as long after the first strangulation as Dr. Zugaby speculated is an open question, as is which of McGowan's attempts to kill her was a successful one. But the general narrative of what happened is not in doubt. According to the transcript of his confession, and this is the actual transcript, I grabbed her and I started to strangle her, and I dragged her off the bed. I tossed her into the corner of my room, on the tile floor, off the rugs. She was trying to, scream, and was fighting back, but of course she really couldn't, since I had my hands around her throat. She stopped struggling, just sort of lay there. I got dressed. I had been sweating so violently. I went out to the garage. I got some plastic bags to put her in. Returning from the garage, I saw that she was still moving, so I began strangling her again, and I hit her head on the floor repeatedly. She began to bleed from the nose, mouth, face. I don't know where. There was blood all over the floor. I then grabbed one of the plastic bags and put it over her head, and I twisted it tightly, and I held it there until she stopped. And then John Douglas says, as I read this in preparation for meeting him, I was thinking to myself, an hour or two earlier, this guy was standing in front of a classroom teaching chemistry to high school students. What led him from point A to this point B? As the confession went on, McGowan described how he lifted Joan's body and placed it in plastic trash bags. Then he wrapped it up in an old sofa cover. He tied it with a cord, he carried it to the garage, and stowed it in the trunk of his car, his new car. Joan had spotted from her front yard, around the corner and down the block. He cleaned up her blood as best he could with some old T-shirts, and then he drove 20 or so miles and dumped the body down the slope in Harriman State Park. He unwrapped it and left it under the rock ledge. He put the plastic bag and the couch cover in a roadside trash can. And when he returned to Hillsdale, he joined the neighborhood search for Joan. I felt better when I went back to the house, he told Dr. Galen. I slept well. He slept well. So, yeah, that's Joan. That's Joan's snow remover that we're reading about. I'm just trying to get you guys to understand the case a little bit of what happened to Joan. To see if you have any questions, but because a lot of it relates, it's very similar to Faye Swetlick. But the other thing I want to touch on is what Rosemarie says about hold on a second. Yeah, because this is something that's like people, always, they're not sure how to handle this stuff with other people, but like you see, Faye had the memorial and everything. But listen to what Rosemary says, because people then, after that, don't leave the people usually alone, and they need people to do the opposite. So Rosemary said the Girl Scouts sent a sympathy card. Other than that, no one in any official capacity made the effort to contact the family. The emptiness really started, Rosemary said, after the burial, when everyone left and went back to their own lives. The most important thing for her at that point was to keep life as normal as possible for Frankie and Marie. I made sure Marie stayed in Girl Scouts because she wanted to, even though it was painful for me to think about Girl Scout cookies. We stayed in the same house, so the familiar things would still be there, like school and friends, and not having more changes to deal with. I tried not to be overprotective. I let them continue to go out and play, though I was always attentive to their whereabouts. They had to be children, and I didn't want to be paranoid. Nor would she shield them from the ongoing news about their little sister's case. I would tell them both what was going on so they would hear it from me. I knew they would be hearing things, and I didn't want them to hear it in a scary way. We would sit on the bedroom floor and talk about anything they had on their minds. They looked forward to knowing that they weren't being left out. Rosemary and Frank took them to the cemetery on various occasions to visit their sister in heaven. Rosemary came to accept the reality that her love and pain could not be separated. I have felt a relationship with Joan in my heart all these years, she said. It's a relationship I wouldn't have chosen, but it's still a relationship that inspires me to do what I do. And I found there is a peace that comes with that. It was not all Rosemary had to contend with. 7 months after the murder, her beloved father died of cancer. He had adored his granddaughter and never stopped grieving for her. Rosemary went to the court hearing where McGowan pled guilty. She felt she had to be there for Joan. Genevieve McGowan was there too. When I walked into the courtroom, she gave me the coldest stare I've ever experienced in my life. It was the first time I had ever seen her. Rosemary would not have minded if McGowan had stood trial, so the truth would have come out and nothing would have been held back, including the details of what happened to Joan. But as what often happens, other types of details began filtering back to her, and one of the most appalling was when she heard through a friend that Genevieve had told an acquaintance from church that she hated Rosemary because if it hadn't been for her, Joe wouldn't have killed Joan and gone to prison. Okay, it's just, and then there's the health issues she dealt with. And then, let's see. She received a telephone call that changed her life yet again on July 26th of 1993, saying that Joseph McCowan was coming up for parole. And this was a shock because Rosemary had not been informed that 6 years could be cut for good behavior and work credit. He had been turned down in 1987, the first time he became eligible, but his chances looked better this time since he'd served more than his minimum sentence. It had been 20 years since the murder, and Rosemary wanted to bring Joan back into public consciousness. Joan back, I'm sorry. It wasn't about dwelling on the grief, but a squeaky wheel to fight to keep her killer in prison and trying to make sure he wouldn't end up for parole every few years. I thought starting a movement of the people would help us all. Rosemary knew she'd have to fight to keep him behind bars. So she began working with local and county officials, district representatives, and the community to organize a vigil on September 30th, 1993 at Veterans Park in Hillsdale, and more than 1,000 supporters attended. The focus had to be to fight to keep McGowan in, and that couldn't be complicated by anything else. So she was wanted to get a divorce at that time, but she couldn't. Their marriage had disintegrated. And so she kept on with that because she had to keep her focus on this. She had two overwhelming reasons to keep him behind bars: to make the punishment, at least in some sense, commiserate with the enormity of the crime, and to make sure there were no other young child that would suffer at McGowan's hands as Joan had. If there were to be any meaning to Joan's death, any meaning to her disappearing on Holy Thursday and being found on Easter Sunday, Rosemary understood she would have to do something herself. The message of hope was clear. It would be a movement for the child protection and helping society inspired by Joan. Holy Thursday and Good Friday. It was as if God, who had ordained free will to mankind and therefore had to suffer the deaths of little children at the hands of those who would forsake his values, was giving her a message. I realized this is the work I'm supposed to do, and I saw it as getting closer to Joan's spirit. That's when the movement started. I didn't get positive support from my family, instead quite the opposite. When family members verbally assaulted me, actually threatened me with physical force, and sent harassing mail in the late 1990s, Michael and John would become involved, but before that, I was pretty much on my own. Michael and John are her youngest boys. She began speaking out. She began organizing. She spearheaded a 9-month campaign to make the public aware of the danger of child predators and the reasons that they should be kept in prison. The parole board listened and once again turned down McGowan's request. Just as important, it reviewed the case and had him transferred to the maximum security facility in Trenton, where the warden felt he should have been to begin with. Additionally, the board imposed a future eligibility term of 20 years before his next hearing. With good behavior and work credits, this could be reduced to 12 years, making him eligible in 2005. And Rosemary did not just let matters stand once his parole was denied. She began a grassroots movement, organizing parents and other interested parties in rallying and petitioning for justice for child victims. She appeared on television and radio and sat for interviews. Wherever she went, she handed out little green bows, Joan's favorite color. It took 3 years of essentially full-time advocacy, and then on April 3rd, 1997, Governor Christine Todd Whitman signed what would become known as Joan's Law. Wearing a green bow on her lapel in memory of Joan, Governor Whitman sat in bright sunshine outside the Bergen County Jail. Rosemary, Frank, and Michael and John stood around her, surrounded by police officers, detectives, sheriff's deputies, and legislators who also supported the campaign to have the law enacted. Joan's Law amended the New Jersey Criminal Code to mandate that anyone convicted of the murder of a child under 14 years of age during the commission of a sexual assault would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rosemary came to the podium and thanked the governor and the sponsors and the supporters of the bill. Maybe this can deter crime. We hope, she stated. Then she held up a photograph of Joan and said, "It's she we have to be thankful for." Joan's spirit is very much alive. She wants you to smile more. She wants you to be more positive. The following year, on October 30th, 1998, President Bill Clinton would sign a federal version of Joan's Law. And 6 years after that, on September 15th, 2004, New York Governor George Pataki traveled to Harriman State Park, the site where Joan's body was found, to sign a Joan's Law for his state. Rosemary could not make this signing, but listened on the phone from her bed. It was where she had made many of her phone calls to connect with the people to get bills passed. Ironically, one convict Joan's Law would not affect was Joan's killer, Joseph McGowan. He had been sentenced before the statute went into code, and the law could not be made retroactive. So according to the instructions of the Court of Appeals, the New Jersey Parole Board and Rosemarie D'Alessandro prepared for the next hearing. And in May 1998, the court ruled that the board had set the parole bar too high. It stated that board members should not consider whether he had been rehabilitated or not, only whether there was substantial reason to believe he would commit another violent crime if released. In other words, was he dangerous? And that's where I came in, John Douglas. So John Douglas was going up there to meet with him. So, very interesting stuff. She's a very inspirational woman. You're back. You're just listening. What happened? Hey, this is it. 1973, Kathy Snyder. She was killed in 1973. So, yeah. Yep, indeed. Yes, he's still in jail. No, never. No, he never got paroled. She fought and fought and fought, and now she doesn't have to worry about it. And now he can't get parole anymore, so he's in jail for life. Yeah, Miracle Two Hearts. John Douglas, you know John Douglas from Mindhunter, right? Well, he's the one that went up to meet with him. 25 years afterwards to make that decision. Hi, Mrs. McJagger. No, it looks like it was just Rosemarie and then her two sons. They got divorced. Yeah, Kristen, it should be very good. I'm just trying to see what McGowan, not McGowan. See, listen, this is, John Douglas said to him, I want to know in your own words what it was like 25 years ago. How did this all happen to get you here? I purposely avoid loaded or descriptive words like kill, assault, or murder, nor did I refer to Joan as his victim or a child. The girl Joan, did you know her? And McGowan says, well, I'd seen her in the neighborhood. His affect was flat, his tone matter of fact. Had she come to the door to sell you the Girl Scout cookies? He said he thought his mother had ordered them from her. A newspaper article quoting a former FBI agent said they found more than 100 empty boxes of Girl Scout cookies in the house. Let's go back to the moment she came to the door. Tell me what happened, step by step. It was almost like a metamorphosis. McGowan's whole demeanor transformed. Even his physical appearance seemed to change before my eyes. His eyes were unfocused. As he looked beyond me and stared to the vacant chair, the vacant cinder block wall, I could tell he was looking completely inward, back a quarter of a century. I could sense he was clicking back to the one story that had never left his mind. The front door was open to the mild spring weather, and from the lower level of the bi-level home, McGowan said he saw her through the screen door standing on the landing. She said she was there to deliver 2 boxes of Girl Scout cookies and to collect $2. He wanted to get her downstairs to the level where he lived, away from his grandmother, who was either sleeping or watching television upstairs. That was why he said He only had a $20 bill and a $1 bill and would have to go get the proper change to get her downstairs with him. The story about being embarrassed over not having the exact amount was all crap to give something innocuous to the psychiatrist. This is what I was hoping would happen during the interview. I've had other similar experiences with other sex offenders, and once you're able to flip their on switch, they don't shut up. When Resler and I interviewed, okay, he goes into somebody else. Let's get back to where he goes. Without looking directly at me, he described luring Joan into the lower level and his bedroom, ordering her to remove her clothes and sexually assaulting her. I asked him if he penetrated her. Just with his finger, he insisted. He asked then how did his DNA get into her, because he said it was on one of his fingers. In a focused and excited state with no indication of any remorse, he described how he picked her up by the ankles and swung her around and slammed her head to the floor, fracturing her skull. The account he gave was not much different from the one he had told detectives and psychiatrists previously. He never attempted to fake empathy, as other offenders had when I interviewed them. What struck me was not the facts, but the obvious intentionality. It was hot as hell outside, but the interview room was very cold. In fact, I was trying to keep myself from shivering as I sat there, even though I was wearing a wool suit. McGowan, on the other hand, had begun perspiring profusely, just as he described the feeling after the attack. He was looking away from me in a trance-like state, breathing heavy, and his prison shirt was drenched with sweat. I could see his chest muscles trembling. I thought immediately of the quotation I had just read from Dr. Galen's initial report. After McGowan had beaten and strangled Joan, she stopped struggling, just sort of lay there. I got dressed. I had begun sweating so violently. In his head and in his physical being, he was right back there, back in the act. It's pretty hard to strangle someone, isn't it? I asked. Even a young person. Yeah, he readily agreed. I didn't realize it would take so much strength. So what did you do? Well, I turned around and I positioned myself behind her. I took that to mean he came around to where her head lay on the floor. And how long did you choke her? Until I thought she was dead. Then what? I went out to get some bags and stuff and to put her clothes in. And when I got back, she was twitching. Now, this was not a blitz-style attack resulting from a momentary surge of uncontrollable rage. He did not suddenly come to his senses and say to himself, "Oh my God, what have I done?" When he saw that she was still twitching, his only thought was to choke her again to make sure she was finally dead. It was almost as if he had murdered her again. The one time I remember McGowan looking right at me during this entire description was when he said, "John, when I heard the knock and looked up through the screen door and saw who was there, I knew I was going to kill her." I can feel two different kinds of rage, he went on. Red rage bothers me, but I can turn my head and focus and control it, like when someone cuts me off in traffic or I have a conflict at school. But white rage, I can't control. And that is what you were feeling when Joan came to your house? Yeah, he said, that's right. Our eyes were still locked. So he killed Joan while seized with white rage. The fact that he even had a name for it told me that he had experienced it before and most likely would again. But he didn't kill her right there at the front door, no matter what he was raging, no matter what was raging within him. At that moment, a methodical plan had been formed instantly in his mind as to how he was going to get her where he wanted her in order to do what he wanted to do. I pointed this out and said to him, "You're not a psychotic, even though you tried to show dissociation from the crime." What I see is pretty logical, rational behavior. He didn't argue with me. As for this psychiatric assertion that the killing was the consequence of an additional upset and failure due to premature ejaculation, wrong again. The killing was the result of a combination of displaced rage, sexual excitement at his momentary power over another human being, and the very practical consideration of leaving no witness to what already was an unspeakable crime. He had admitted as much in the interview with Dr. Galen when he said, "If I let her go, my whole life was gone. All I could think of was just to get rid of her." I wondered if anyone before me had ever taken the time to correlate all of McGowan's statements together. But I didn't minimize the killing as merely a practical consideration to avoid being identified and caught. This was not a question of simply going too far. The way McGowan described it, I could tell the gratification and emotional fulfillment of the act went through to the brutal murder itself and the ability to destroy something or someone. At one point I asked him, "If I could have captured one video image of your face while you were doing this, what would it show me?" Obligingly, his face contorted into what I would characterize as an intense, malevolent, satisfied grimace. Even the way he described the body disposal was logical and methodical, as opposed to panicked or hurried. He got some towels and cleaning materials to wipe up the blood, trying to get this potential forensic evidence out there so that his mother wouldn't see it. And in case the police searched the premises, he wrapped the body in a carpet and drove some distance to a setting he was familiar with to dump it. And then he went back home and acted as if nothing happened. Joining the neighborhood search for Joan was a conscious means of covering his tracks. Most cons know they potentially have something to gain from the interviewer's good report. They will try to BS to one extent or another. There was none of that with McGowan. I think that was because I was well prepared, and he was intelligent enough to understand that it wouldn't work. His goal in agreeing to talk to me was to improve his chances of parole, and he knew that my catching him up in a lie was not going to cut it. And the whole point of my approach was to make the subject comfortable enough to let me know what he was actually thinking and feeling. What did surprise me was that he didn't even try to express any sorrow for what he had done, or feeling for Joan's family. He was certainly sorry that his whole thing had happened. I was not the first one to hear that sentiment, but there was no sense of emotional comprehension of what he had taken away from this little girl. All those who loved her and all those who had come into her brief life. The impression I received was that he was telling me that since he couldn't bring this young girl back to life, he just had to move on, and everyone should understand that. The murder was simply a fact of life to him, as if he had cancer or heart attack, and now the doctors were determining if he was well enough to leave the hospital and resume normal life. And then he's okay. As I listened to each detail of the deadly encounter between Joseph McGowan and Joan D'Alessandro, I focused not only on the fact of violence and sexual assault, but on the way it was done. The fixation with the act itself, not the personality or specifically the victim. I didn't doubt McGowan had some pedophilic tendencies, as he'd suggest in some of his previous interviews. That would certainly go along with his lack of social sophistication and his deep-seated feelings of inadequacy. But he had no prior sexual offenses on his records, even minor ones. And there was nothing in the file about search warrants turning up any child pornography or fantasy writing about children. If he fantasized, I thought it would be about an adult woman, and the only real fantasy here was a fantasy of power. What became clear for me as I talked with him about the crime, primarily an act of rage that escalated quickly from red to white, was triggered by something, some precipitating event, though I wasn't quite sure at this point what it was. My guess, based on his living situation, his inability to see his engagement through to marriage, and my extensive knowledge of other sexual predators, was that it had something to do with his mother. Still, it gnawed at me that I couldn't pinpoint exactly what had sent him off. As I listened to McGowan, I realized that what had gotten him off was the act rather than the victim. All the people who had interviewed him before were barking up the wrong tree if they were trying to get him to talk about his pedophilia. There was nothing either obsessive or particularly pleasurable in his description of what he did to the 7-year-old girl. Not only that, this was a child he had seen frequently in the neighborhood. He had never previously attempted to single her out for special attention, to befriend her, seduce her, or groom her. The violence, the sexual degradation, the murder, these were all manifestations of raw rage. No fantasy scenario was being acted out, not even a sexual sadistic one. What was significant about this particular victim of opportunity was that she was small and vulnerable. If it had been someone McGowan saw could put up a good fight, no crime would have taken place. And then we began to talk about his possible release from prison. At one point I asked Joe, "What are you planning to do when you get out?" I was careful to say when, not if. I wanted to keep the conversation as positive as I could, so he would be candid with me. He told me he was going to go to New York to meet up with another ex-con who was an electrician. He had promised McGowan a job as an assistant. I told him that I was raised in New York and returned frequently, and then that he would be shocked to see how expensive it was to live there. He glanced furtively over his shoulder at the door to make sure the guards couldn't hear, and then he said, "I have money." See, this is what about the money. "What kind of money could you have being in a place like this for the past 25 years? I responded, "It can't be from making license plates." In a low voice, he said that when his grandmother and mother passed away, he received a fairly substantial chunk from their life insurance policies and the sale of the house. He said it was in his bank. He said it was in a bank out of state, hundreds of thousands of dollars. "Why is that?" I asked. He whispered, "I don't want the victim's family to be able to get the money." What I was thinking to myself was, this guy just won't let up. He has absolutely no regard for the people he's hurt and whose lives he has changed forever. What I said was, "You know, you're a pretty smart guy, Joe, the way you figured it all out. I think you'll do really well in New York." This was both necessary to maintain my rapport with the subject and not a lie. I did think he was pretty smart and resourceful, and that he would be able to figure out a way through a place as intense as New York. I just didn't say how appalled I was at his scheme. Just as in negotiating a high-level business deal, you have to know when to speak up and when to shut up, as difficult as it may be. We later found out that an investigator had looked into Genevieve McGowan's will and money trail on Rosemary's behalf. She had sold her Hillsdale home shortly after the murder and moved to Villas, New Jersey. When she sold that house, she moved in with her niece in Wisconsin for a while and then went to live at a Franciscan care center. She died in April of 1992. Her will set up various trusts, one of them benefiting a niece. The will was probated in Wisconsin since Genevieve was living there, and Jim discovered that all the funds had been dispersed and there was nothing left for the D'Alessandros to touch. Apparently, Genevieve had anticipated claims on anything coming directly to Joe, so she had protected her assets from any claims arising out of a wrongful death suit by making distributions throughout the years. She had instructed the niece to take care of Joe and give him whatever he needed without actually having him legally control the money. This is what he must have meant when he told me that the money was held and protected out of state. The sentiments behind these arrangements reminded me of Genevieve's comments to her church acquaintance that she hated Rosemary and blamed her for all of Joe's troubles. One of the hallmarks of narcissistic, borderline, and sociopathic personalities is their unwillingness to assume personal responsibility for anything. It's always someone else's fault. So, and then as we concluded the interview, I shook McGowan's hand and thanked him for talking to me. I wished him good luck and tried to give him no indication of my personal feelings about him or my recommendation to the parole board. And then okay, so on November 6, 1998, the New Jersey Parole Board issued its official report denying parole to Joseph McGowan. In the statement explaining its reasoning, the board cited several factors. First, there was the brutality of the crime itself, and second, it found that McGowan's lack of insight and concern over what caused him to commit the murder was extremely disconcerting. The board felt he had made little progress in addressing the issues that led to the crime, and that was largely due to the lack of candor and honesty with the various psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, and other authorities with whom he had spoken with over the years in captivity. The board noted that while McGowan had taken part in many hours of therapy, no more than 4 had focused on his anger at his mother, which he finally conceded, as the report stated, was a primary motivator behind the commission of the murder. The key consideration, however, was the board's opinion that the state of mental and emotional health was not far different than it had been in the past, and it remains substantially likely McGowan would commit a crime if released on parole. The other issue to be dealt with was the future eligibility term, or FET, known informally within the prison system as a HIT. The board referred that determination to the 3-member panel of board members as standard practice. On January 7, 1999, the panel imposed a 30-year FET, theoretically meaning the prisoner would not be eligible for parole again for 3 decades. In practice, that was not exactly the case, since the State of Appeals had directed the parole board to review its initial 1993 decision, which meant the HIT meter started running from that date. Also, like all parole-eligible prisoners, McGowan received statutory credits for work and good behavior. Even more important, as a safeguard against abuse of the system, offenders in McGowan's category were legally entitled to an annual review hearing, at which point the parole board could institute a new evaluation if it believed his situation had changed. This may all seem like an excursion into the bureaucratic weeds, but it's this kind of procedural process that determines freedom or continued incarceration, and by extension, it therefore determines where the public is subject to the risk of individuals who have shown a previous propensity towards violence. McGowan appealed the FET to the full board, which affirmed the 3-person panel decision on August 2, 1999. He then took his complaint to the Appellate Division of the Superior Court of New Jersey in McGowan versus New Jersey State Parole Board ruling. His attorney argued that he had been a model prisoner for almost 30 years and that there was no evidence he would ever reoffend if released, and therefore the board had acted in an arbitrary and capricious fashion. Suffering through a particularly bad period of her chronic condition, Rosemary issued a victim impact statement from her living room. On February 15, 2002, the court released its ruling, which upheld the parole board's denial and declared the decision to impose a 30-year FET is within the board's discretion and is supported by the substantial evidence. Okay, and then Joan's legacy. On April 3rd, 2014, the anniversary of the signing of the first Joan's Law near the town train station, Hillsdale unveiled and dedicated a stone sculpture and garden in memory of Joan. The sculpture and garden were funded by Joan's Joy supporters. Many local businesses also pitched in, donating their time and resources. On the brick path leading to the sculpture is a custom-made park bench in green, Joan's favorite color. There is a white butterfly in the center of the back, and above it, a reproduction of Joan's signature from a butterfly she drew when she was 4.5. It is flanked by orange flowers taken from one of her drawings. Speaking of Rosemarie, County Executive Kathleen O'Donovan said, "She has turned her grief into something that has been a real shining star and shining example for us to follow." The side of the monument facing the street highlights a white butterfly and the legend, "Remember Joan today, so tomorrow's children will be safe." The side facing the train station, where it will be seen by all the visitors and residents returning home, bears the smiling, achingly evocative picture of Joan in her brownie uniform and an account of her story. The Joan Angela D'Alessandro Memorial Foundation raised the funds for the sculpture. A beautiful and colorful garden surrounding the sculpture was planted and dedicated on June 27, 2014, and on April 19, 2018, the Child Safety Forever Foundation was unveiled in the garden. Its continuous flow of water symbolizes, fountain. I'm really losing it tonight. Its continuous flow of water symbolizes the never-ending importance of child safety. The carved-in stone account briefly relates the story of how Joan came to be represented by a white butterfly. On a cold day in April 2006, during a visit to the site where Joan's body was found in Harriman State Park, Rosemarie spotted a white butterfly hovering behind the split boulder where she was found. Having already invested great significance and spiritual meaning in the fact that Joan was murdered on Holy Thursday and discovered on Easter Sunday, Rosemarie took the beautiful creature as a sign that Joan's soul was happy. As she related the story over the following months and years, the butterfly came to symbolize Joan's unquenchable energy and spirit. What we're doing today, coming all together, is all about social justice, Rosemarie said at the dedication. When you see this sculpture, something is going to happen to each of you, and I hope that you share it with people who aren't here. While all of the others were praising her, Rosemarie was praising her daughter. My main inspirational person is Joan. I would not have been doing what I was doing to this day if it wasn't for her inspiration. And it's like she's telling me what I'm doing. Despite this heartbreaking inspiration, Rosemarie wants visitors to think of the sculpture and garden not as a place of sadness, but a place of joy, of peace, of education, of awareness, of child safety, and last but not least, as a place of hope for society. It is also the site of the annual Child Safety Fest fundraiser, furthering the foundation's mission. Reading the words on the stone made me recall something, a small detail, from the day that Mark, Carolyn, and I went to Rosemarie's house. We had completed our discussion, and Rosemarie, Michael, and John were serving us lunch on the screen porch at the back of the house. It was a cool fall day. Somewhere, suddenly from nowhere, it seemed a pure white butterfly appeared and hovered in the air above us. We all marveled at the coincidence. "See," said Rosemarie, "she's with us." This many years later, Joan's influence is still being felt, not only on a public policy level, but on a personal level. Recently, a middle-aged man told Rosemarie how much he had loved being around Joan and playing with her. He recounted that when he and his friends would get in a fight, Joan would break it up with the directive, "Oh, come on, let's play, let's do something," and that would take care of it. The enchanting 7-year-old's words echo in Rosemarie's mind. "Oh, come on, let's play, let's do something, and that's why I keep on doing." Ouch. So so at least now I think that you have a good understanding of the case of who Rosemarie is and what she's dedicated to. Oh, that's nice. Tea praying. So does my mother and father. Your vision is being blurry. Oh, sorry. But so any of your questions, get them ready. Yeah, Vivian. I just want to get, hold on a second. Oh, come on, stop. What is this? So let's see here. Why did it go to this? How do I get out of here? They say Paula's law. Joan D'Alessandro's mom pushes for parole ban for child murderers, but what is Paula's law now? This is a recent. Each time Rosemarie D'Alessandro visits the site where her daughter's body was found in 1973, she sees a white butterfly. On Tuesday, she saw 2. Rosemarie D'Alessandro on Tuesday visited the site where the body of her 7-year-old daughter Joan was found in 1973, and once again, Joan's mother went to the edge of Harriman State Park to advocate for criminal justice reform to protect children. This time, though, it was in the memory of another murder victim and in support of another mother whose child was brutally taken away. D'Alessandro wants New York to extend Joan's law, a bill she helped form in 2004, but she wants the new version called Paula's Law. That's because she hopes New York will extend the ban on parole for someone who murders a child under the age of 14 during a sexual attack set forth in Joan's law. She wants the new law to apply to anyone who kills a child under the age of 18. And she wants it named in memory of Paula Bohavesky, a talented 16-year-old girl who was bludgeoned to death in a Pearl River alley by two men in 1980. The idea came to Rosemarie after hearing last month that one of Paula's killers had been granted parole. D'Alessandro first raised the idea in an interview with the Journal, in which she spoke of her empathy and concern for Paula's mother, Lois. State Senator David Carlucci from New York contacted D'Alessandro after a reporter reached out to him for comment on the idea. On July 17th of 2019, he introduced Paula's Law, which would extend Joan's Law just as D'Alessandro envisioned. In New Jersey, Joan's Law was updated in 2017 to address victims under the age of 18. There's a federal version of Joan's Law as well, which applies to crimes against children under the age of 14. Repeated parole hearings in New York. A prisoner can be brought up for parole every 2 years. Traumatizes families, D'Alessandro said. She really doesn't get a break, she said of Lois. It's not human. The testifying is horrible, just horrible. Lois was not at Tuesday's press conference, but Carlucci said she was aware of the legislation. Carlucci stood on a podium set up along Gate Hill Road in Harriman State Park with a full Rockland legislative contingent. Senator James Scotus, Assemblyman Ken Zabrowski, and then goes through everybody who was there, are now working on an assembly version of Paula's Law. Joan and Paula, they had a future. They deserved a future, Zabrowski said. Parole dishonors the memory of these two young individuals. These laws wouldn't apply to either Joan D'Alessandro or Paula's killers since they predate the legislative changes. But it can help others, Rosemarie D'Alessandro said. And I will show you. This is her in July. Oops, I always have to do it twice. In July, where she goes to Harriman with a photo of Joan, huge photo of Joan. After the short speeches, Rosemarie, accompanied by two of her sons, placed a bouquet of blue flowers tied with a blue ribbon near the sign that stands in memory of Joan in the grove of trees below green ribbons that had been tied around several trunks. Blue was Paula's favorite color. Green was Joan's. Affixed under the sign in Joan's memory is a small plaque with a butterfly. Rosemarie D'Alessandro noted that every time she visits the site where her daughter's body was found on Easter Sunday, she sees a white butterfly. On Tuesday, she saw two. So, you want a cake, more kind. Okay, so hopefully you guys have a better understanding. Hey, this is it. You're still not feeling well? Yeah, Vivian, yep. Yeah, sunflower, absolutely. A ladybug rose in my car today. Oh, yeah? That's nice. Oh, it's later than we thought. But that was, that's okay because I wanted you guys to be familiar with it, and hopefully people rewatch so that when she does come, you guys are familiar with what's, you know, the whole thing. You're welcome, Vivica. But yeah, we will go because it is late and we're past our bedtime. But anyway, yeah. So check it out yourself. Look up her name. I mean, you can see a lot of stuff. You can look up if you're interested in the court papers. You can find those too. Possums are astonishing messengers. Yeah, possums? Okay. Hey, Gigi. Hi, Alma. Can I read some Seavers? Maybe after Rosemary comes. Is it under? Well, it's under 18. I don't know if it. No, it's not for all states. I don't think so yet. This was just very recent. That Kathy, that was July of 2019. So I'm sure you could ask her that. You could ask her that. That would probably be a very good question about, you know, what it would take to do that. And if we can help, you know, if anybody can help in doing that. Write that down. All right. Good night, everybody. Have a good night. We'll talk about it more, and yeah, write any questions down you have. Yeah, all night long. Sure. not tonight. All right, guys. Take it. I look like I'm going to a party. I've been crafting all day. All right, everybody, take care. God bless. Love you guys. Prayers to all who need them. Stay safe. Be kind. And I'll see you next time.